Good morning, everyone. It is good to see you on this rainy day. She was shouting her head off. Her daughter was being tormented by a demon, and she was going to keep shouting until someone listened to her because she needed help, and the only tool she had was her voice. So she raised it just as loud as she could to see if she could get Jesus's attention and Jesus's help. Now, the disciples weren't too happy with all of this shouting. They wanted to send this woman away to get rid of her. People were coming to them day and night for help, and they much preferred the people who waited patiently and quietly, the people who didn't create too much of a scene. But the Canaanite woman wasn't about to pipe down and wait her turn. She needed help, and she needed it now. She knew that she and her daughter were worthy of God's love and God's healing. Now, Jesus, who we would have expected to override the disciples' callousness, ends up digging an even deeper hole. He responds to the woman's shouting, saying, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." In other words, I'm not here for Canaanites. In other words, you and your daughter aren't my priority. In other words, go away, stop bothering me, I've got others to attend to. But of course, the Canaanite woman wasn't about to give up. She wasn't going to allow Jesus to ignore her, and so she knelt down and asked again, with great dignity, for Jesus's help. And to our great dismay as listeners, Jesus makes a most shocking reply. He calls this woman a dog. A dog. It's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs, Jesus tells her. And of course, we're hurt, offended, dismayed. How could gentle, sweet Jesus call this woman a dog? Just because she's from a different ethnic group, just because she's an outsider to the house of Israel. Hadn't Jesus already embraced other outsiders in his ministry? And yet, even after this awful slap in the face, the Canaanite woman persisted. She was determined to wrestle a blessing out of Jesus one way or another. And so she artfully one-ups Jesus, beating him at his own rhetorical game. If I were a dog, she says, I'd at least receive the scraps from the table. I deserve at least that. And in that very moment, Jesus seems to experience a revelation of some sort. Jesus suddenly sees the Canaanite woman as whole and worthy, not just worthy of crumbs, of scraps, but worthy of the kingdom. Her persistence changes something in him, awakens something in him, and healing ensues. Even though he changes his mind in the end, though, this passage paints a pretty deeply unflattering picture of Jesus. It's not one we like to look at. Many of us will also be disturbed to have witnessed the Canaanite woman groveling for recognition, being subjected to verbal abuse, and having to beg simply to receive what is her due as a child of God. And even though she persisted and changed Jesus' mind, this episode still doesn't feel fully redeemed. So what are we to take from this less than laudable moment in the life and ministry of Jesus? And given that this episode doesn't reflect very favorably on Jesus, why did the gospel editors decide to keep this particular memory of Jesus in the gospel record? I wonder if it's not so much because of what we can learn from Jesus, but rather because of what we can learn from the Canaanite woman. One of the most powerful features of this passage, as I see it, is that the Canaanite woman was not afraid to tell the truth. She was not afraid to shout loudly against discrimination and disenfranchisement. She was not afraid to claim her worth, even in the face of rejection and abusive speech. She was not willing to be diminished. and she was willing to shout about it, to shout until things finally changed. I think this is a really important thing to reflect on in our particular cultural moment. Because in liberal white culture especially, many of us tend to shut down when people shout too much. In liberal white culture, many of us don't have much space for anger or rage. And we've developed some extraordinarily harmful tropes about people who bravely dare to express anger in public. In particular, the trope of the angry Black woman is used to discredit the legitimacy of the things Black women say by calling them emotional and irrational. In her book, Eloquent Rage, a Black feminist discovers her superpower. Rutgers professor Brittany Cooper remarks, "When it comes to Black women, sometimes Americans don't realize that sass is simply a more palatable form of rage. Black women turn to sass when rage is too risky because we have jobs to keep, families to feed, and bills to pay." Ultimately, Cooper argues, angry Black women are looked upon as entities to be contained, as inconvenient citizens who keep on talking about their rights while refusing to do their duty and smile at everyone. But Black women, she says, have the right to be mad as hell. Indeed, as did the Canaanite woman. So if you were raised to think that anger is bad, as I was, perhaps it's time to rethink that bias a little bit. Anger can, in fact, be profoundly mobilizing. Anger can provoke real, necessary change. Anger can make important things happen in the world, drawing attention to injustice and harm. And yet, for so many of us, anger makes us nervous, uncomfortable. It feels impolite, off-putting, abrasive. In my Midwestern childhood, we were largely taught to swallow our feelings rather than express them. Even in the face of grave injustice, strong emotion would not often have been welcome. It's taken many years of work for me to accept a broader range of emotional expression, to accept anger in myself and others, to accept that people are usually angry for a reason, and that when they're angry, they probably need to be listened to. But there's no need to cower in fear or run away in avoidance, only to try to understand. I'm still not all the way there. I still don't like shouting, and I still shy away from anger. But I know that these strong emotions are often signals that someone has experienced harm and might be in need of understanding, of compassion, of help. You see, so many people, just like the Canaanite woman, don't have the luxury of being quiet. For so many people, silence equals death. So as a church that wants to be committed to social justice, perhaps we are being called to pay better attention to those we think we can safely ignore, to those we have so often casually disregarded. Those people shouting about problems we don't quite understand, using language that may ruffle our feathers and a style that may unsettle our sensibilities. Perhaps these people are the Canaanite woman in our midst. But like Jesus, we'd usually rather focus on our own, on people like us, on people who make us comfortable. But just as Jesus' eyes were opened to the Canaanite woman, so may ours be as well, to suffering and injustice in our midst. May it be so. Amen. I invite John Gresha now to introduce our choral anthem for the day.